I usually walk around. I teach at this building a lot, so to stay here at the podium is going to be tough for me. My PowerPoints are not as pretty as the students. I was a high schooler in the 80s, so the most technological device I had was a Casio calculator watch. And then after that, when I graduated, it was a pager. And I'm sure some of you in the room could relate to that. But the information is important. So my name's John-Obert-Thorn. I'm a police officer for the Nassau County Police Department. I work in the central testing section. That's a particular area where if one is arrested for driving under the influence of either drugs and/or alcohol, they come to central testing where I work, where they're processed and tested by way of their breath, blood, and/or urine, depending on the situation. I'm also what you call a drug recognition expert. So if somebody is arrested for driving under the influence of drugs, I evaluate them. It's about a 2-hour evaluation where I interview them, I test them to see if they actually are impaired by a particular category or categories of drugs. So that it's a very comprehensive evaluation. But along the way of testing people who are arrested for drugs and driving, you come to get a different perspective on the people who are unfortunately addicted to drugs. But we've all been bombarded with the drug epidemic. I will hit upon that a little bit today, but I think there's also, from a law enforcement perspective, another problem that's kind of clashing is people who are driving under the influence of drugs and/or alcohol. Every study so far where labs across New York State test blood on people who, or law enforcement who are requesting blood tests, meaning that they were likely involved in an accident, a fatal accident, or arrested, almost 40, and depending on the study, 50% have both alcohol and illicit drugs in their system. So the combo is not getting any better. So in a nutshell, people are driving under the influence more. Thankfully, the deaths related to drunk driving actually have been decreasing, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But drugs and drug driving is unfortunately increasing, and a lot of it just goes unnoticed. So part of what I do as well is I teach police officers on how to recognize the subtle signs of somebody who's under the influence of drugs. And this we could use for our own kids and for your students, because certain drugs cause certain physiological reactions in people. And a lot of it is common sense, but I'm going to review a couple of those things and review what we call the 7 drug categories and what are the general indicators or outward signs that you might see when somebody is under the influence of a particular type of drug category. And then I'll touch upon a couple of other things regarding to drug addiction and so forth. And I have a few videos too. I'm going to skip that till later. So basically we're going to describe the involvement of drugs in schools and society, and we're going to go over the 7 drug categories. Just some quick minor facts. There's so much information. Sometimes it's overwhelming with drug addiction and teen drug use, and depending on what state you're looking at. If you look at one perspective from Colorado, that was ground zero for legalization of marijuana recreational use. One study after study, everything is roses, everything's perfect, everything is down. In terms of crime and teen use, you look at another study, everything is up. So sometimes it gets so overwhelming, you have to sift through, the details. But some teen drug abuse facts: every 17 seconds, a teenager experiments with a drug for the first time. That's pretty unbelievable if you think about it across America. Prescription drug abuse has gone up over 400%. So people are dying, people are getting addicted, people are abusing prescription drugs more and more, and teens and young adults are of no exception to that. And this exceeds actually heroin, ecstasy, and cocaine combined. So think about that. The abuse of prescription drugs, such as opioids, like Percocet, OxyContin. If you've been reading up on what happened to the manufacturers of OxyContin, they've basically been sued now, gone bankrupt. Of course, they put their billions across seas, so they can't be taken through lawsuits. But because OxyContin was really the foundation to the opioid epidemic, because they knew that it was highly, highly addictive. And the pharmaceutical company who made that drug and was kind of suppressed, and physicians didn't know how addictive it was, and that really is what catapulted this whole problem we're seeing with opioids. One of the daggers. So prescription medication exceeds even that of illicit drugs, which is unbelievable. So let's get to the 7 drug categories that, from a drug recognition expert, the perspective of what I look for in people who are under the influence of drugs, particularly when they're driving, which obviously common sense-wise is not a good combination, because drug involvement, including alcohol, actually causes some pretty severe and significant driving impairment, even at low levels. And when you talk about alcohol, any departure from a 0.08 is considered legally intoxicated, but we know through studies that even at a 0.05, one is impaired and shouldn't be driving. Ironically, the United States, Canada, and maybe the one country, the UK, well, basically the only ones who are still at a 0.08 in terms of a legal limit. The rest of the world is at a 0.05 or zero tolerance, because the studies are overwhelmingly saying that any departure from a BAC or blood alcohol concentration of 0 is impairing your skills needed for safe driving. So we're a little behind, but there's so much political fight with lowering the legal limit for a variety of reasons. It's the world we live in. But the first 7 drug categories are central nervous system depressants, central nervous system stimulants, hallucinogens, dissociative anesthetics, narcotic analgesics or opioids, inhalants, and cannabis. By far and away, the most frequent that we see who are driving under the influence, and this kind of spills over into what most people, particularly youngsters, preteens and teens and young adults are using, come from the category of central nervous system depressants, opioids, and cannabis and marijuana. So a CNS depressant really is anything that depresses your central nervous system. And that includes alcohol. And alcohol, believe it or not, is still king. It's still number one, the most frequently abused drug, because alcohol is a drug. And the most frequently abused by preteens, teens, young adults, and all the way up through adulthood. Still kills more people per year. Just the toxicity of drinking alcohol and the overindulgence of alcohol, and unfortunately into alcoholism. I think we had, how many opioid overdoses or drug overdoses last year? The majority were due to opioids, was I think 70,000 people last year, which if you think about it, a rough number is unbelievable, don't you think? I mean, that's like a jumbo jet, like maybe crashing 2 a week. We wouldn't stand for that. We'd be like, why are these jets crashing every week? 300 people dying every week. Well, that's what's happening with the overdose of drugs. Alcohol alone is about 88,000, so it's already still number one killer, and still very much abused. But other CNS depressants, a very, very popular one is called Xanax. It's another type of CNS depressant. It's probably one of the most prescribed drugs out there, and very, very dependent, causing drug and highly impairing, and typically mixed with alcohol. So one doesn't have to drink as much alcohol. They take a little alcohol and then mix it with some Xanax, and they'll get very, very high off that without the overindulgence of the volume of just the sheer liquid of alcohol. One of the things that I look for, and that I teach to teachers in what we call a DITEP program, drugs that impair, and we teach teachers, social workers, phys ed teachers, it's either 4, 8-hour, or 2-day course, are some of the things that we look for with people who are acutely under the influence of particular types of drugs. And one of it is called horizontal gaze nystagmus. It's an eye test. Certain drugs cause your eyes to move dysfunctionally. If you were to look at my eyes, and if I was following a moving target, it would be maybe a police officer's pen, let's say. My eyes should move very smoothly. If you were to test each other, you'll see that your partner's, your neighbor's eye there, are going to move very smoothly going across the field of view. Similar to a windshield wiper going across your windshield when it's very wet and rainy, nice and smooth. But certain drugs cause a breakdown of this movement. and cause a choppiness to the eyes, and then nystagmus, or an involuntary jerking of the eyes while the person gazes towards the side. So it's a very good indicator for us to determine that this is likely caused by a CNS depressant or a dissociative anesthetic, which I'll get into, or inhalant drugs, which I'll get into. So I'm going to show you a little demonstration of what that looks like. I'm going to skip ahead to the video a little bit. He's testing this person's eye. So the first thing that you could look for, here's just basically an example of lack of smooth pursuit. That eye right now is following a stimulus, and it's not smooth as it goes across the field of view, if you notice. You see how it jerks as it goes across? It's not smooth. That's not normal. And there's virtually, in the drug world, no other reason for this to occur other than somebody who overindulged in either alcohol or certain types of drugs. You see how it's going across like this? It should be smooth, and it's not. This is gaze nystagmus. They are looking at something to the side, a stimulus, and a person who's not under the influence will be able to focus on that stimulus, but the eye keeps jerking in the side. That's called nystagmus. And that's not normal either. And there's virtually no other reason for that to occur in these characteristics other than certain drugs and alcohol. See that jerking, that nystagmus, that's not normal. Okay? So it's a very simple test that we do that everybody could learn as parents, as teachers. It takes about 5 minutes to learn, and it's a really good indicator to rule out certain types of drugs. Okay, because what's happening with the eyes is a reflection of what's happening with the brain. Okay, that is really what happens with drugs. It affects the brain, hormones, neurotransmitters, and the eyes are very sensitive. So even medically, we look at the eyes, right? How's the pupil size? Are they unequal? Are they dilated? Are they constricted? Because the eyes are really, really good source of what's happening going on in the brain, and it's no different for drugs. I have questions at the end, I promise. There's another example, okay? Jerkiness, not normal. Okay, there are other forms of nystagmus, but these characteristics are very, very likely. I know this one is definitely due to drugs. So I'm going to play another video, and I want to test to see how everybody's eyes here work, okay? So pay attention, sit up nice and tall, because I'm going to test you, all right? Concentrate. Anybody guess? All right, keep it to yourself. Let's see if you're right. Very good. You're not under the influence of drugs. Okay, but what about this? Okay, so show of hands who missed the gorilla. Be honest. Yeah, look around. Okay, that's about what typically is what to be expected. You're probably wondering, what are we looking at? Okay, I'm going to make the connection. So yeah, that was over 50% of the room missed the gorilla. It was actually a little bit more. Our vision and visual processing, that's called inattentional blindness, essentially. When we focus on one thing, we're actually blinded to things that are, even though they're in our field of view, we don't see it. The connection with drugs and alcohol is that more than 50% of the room didn't see that. When drugs or alcohol is involved, that almost goes to 70 to 80% of the people miss it. And that's just a little smidgen of what happens when somebody's under the influence and they're driving. Their ability to process visual stimuli has gone down significantly, which is why we have people who bounce off many different cars. They literally are not seeing and not processing what's in front of them fast enough, or they're going down a highway for miles and miles and miles. So drugs impact one of the most important systems, and that is vision. And our vision is not perfect, as you all just witnessed to begin with. So drugs on top of that is something that we have to try to remedy because it's just, it's way too dangerous. So just a little example of how vision is not perfect. The most commonly used CNS depressants, by far and away for us, what we see is Xanax. And these are all CNS depressants or anti-anxiety medications. The problem is that they're highly abused and very dependent. So once this person starts using them, they have to start taking them more often. It actually causes a lot of times a paradoxical effect where if without them they start becoming more anxious and have higher anxiety. So they got to take more of the drug to eventually dependent or addicted to it. So a person under the influence of a CNS depressant, what do they look like? So if you have a student, a family member, or what have you, what does that person look like? Well, typically they look like a person who's intoxicated, who's drunk, but they just don't have the odor because it's basically affecting the brain the same way as alcohol. Okay, so they'll talk, look like a drunk, walk like one, but they just probably won't smell like one. That's the telltale sign of a CNS depressant. Okay, so you have like one, but they just probably won't smell like one. That's the telltale sign of a CNS depressant. Okay, so you have a student who looks drunk. Are they drunk? Maybe they have Xanax. Maybe they took a central nervous system depressant of some sort. That video with the eyes, that horizontal gaze nystagmus test, central nervous system depressants will typically cause those dysfunctional movements in the eye. So again, a very sensitive test for help for police to identify somebody who might be under the influence. Again, these things could be used in schools, at home, with your own children if you have to. So again, general indicators, their reduced ability to divide their attention, they're disoriented, sluggish, thick, slurred speech, drunk-like behavior, droopy eyes. So that's category number one. Category number two is CNS stimulants. Probably the most common is what? Yeah, I heard a few. Cocaine, amphetamines. Yeah, cocaine is by far still very, very common. Crack was very, very common in the late 80s, 90s. Crack is essentially cocaine, just made differently to make it rock-like. Cocaine is still very prevalent. We still have people in possession of cocaine and driving under the influence of cocaine. Methamphetamine. Anybody see the series or part of the series of Breaking Bad? I don't even have to say it. Breaking Bad, that was about a methamphetamine dealer. And thankfully, it's not highly prevalent in Long Island because it is another hugely addictive and debilitating drug. In my opinion, even worse than opioids and how it demolishes the body so quickly. It's very popular in the Midwest and West Coast. And then there's amphetamine, prescription things that you could get from a physician that's also highly abused. And we want to take a guess, college students and even high school students, what stimulant? Right, exactly. Ritalin, Adderall, Dexedrine, because the drugs do work. They do make a change. They do create you to be more alert. So students use them. They could stay up all night and study and be clear-headed for the exam. The problem is that what goes up comes down, And you're going to have a very, very hard downside effect of this drug. The way you look like, you basically just you're hungover, essentially is what you look and act like. And they're highly addictive. So general indicators for somebody under the influence of a CNS stimulant. They're restless typically. Extremely restless. Body tremors possibly, hyper, excited, euphoric, very talkative, exaggerated reflexes, high anxiety possibly. Now we could have all these things, but this would be taken up about tenfold under an acute episode of a stimulant. So the next one, hallucinogens. And just by the name, this is essentially what this drug does, or what the user wants to experience, hallucinogenic highs, where they might hear, see, and feel things that just aren't there. It's just not the reality. But this is what they want to experience. It's not too common that we get this under an impaired driver, but it is commonly abused by young adults, particularly in the 90s, early 2000s. Anybody want to take a guess at what one of the most frequently abused hallucinogen drug that was out there at one point in time? LSD was definitely huge. And then after LSD, right, Molly, ecstasy, MDMA, a very popular drug. It's not as popular. The rave parties where they'd flash glow sticks around and they have to drink a lot of water and suck on their beanies to keep their mouths moving and so forth. And they were sweating a lot because of the extreme body temperature raises. So yeah, Molly and ecstasy, again, not something that we frequently see. Thank God that has gone down in terms of our local area and people under the influence and driving. But here's just a little image of LSD that is dripped onto this little stamp thing that a person just puts on their tongue. It immediately absorbs into their tongue and they start tripping. Here's an example of some Molly or ecstasy, different types of pills. Obviously they're not prescribed pills, so they're made illicitly with all different symbols on them that sometimes mean how much of a drug is in that one or what dealer that one came from. So this is not normal to see or find these things. So general indicators of hallucinogens. Hallucinations, that's the number one. That is the number one reason why people take these drugs. They want to hallucinate. Paranoia, nausea, perspiring, dazed appearance, having flashbacks, body tremors, uncoordinated. But hallucinations is really the key. They'll say things that are just bizarre. There's natural hallucinogens that people could get online for a small price that are legal. They're made from either mushrooms or plants, herbs, cactus. There are even toads out west that contain hallucinogenic toxins that people go and get and lick to get high. But it's all there. Dissociative anesthetics, another drug category. PCP, ketamine, these are anesthetic drugs. PCP used to be used for surgery as an anesthetic, but they realized it had way too many side effects. But unbelievably, it's still easily made illicitly and used. We see a decent amount of PCP impaired individuals driving, believe it or not, coming through central testing. Cold medicines contain a drug called dextromethorphan in it. And if you take enough of it, it is considered a dissociative anesthetic or a hallucinogen. So a lot of times young adults abuse this because it's easy to get, it's legal, and the internet will tell you exactly how to use it, how to take it to get to what particular level of hallucinogenic experience you want to be at, unbelievably. There's nothing you can't get on the internet or find out how to do, how to hide drugs, make drugs, how to take drugs, for better or worse. So PCP, analogs, ketamine, dextromethorphan, all highly used still. Some general indicators of dissociative anesthetics, perspiring, that's a big one, and a blank stare. They're basically staring at, through you. Okay, it's a very telling stare. It's like a 1,000-yard stare that's just unfocused. It's a telltale sign for us that they could be on PCP. Cyclic behavior that might be really nice, kind, then very aggressive and agitated. A chemical odor, an increased pain threshold, because remember PCP is an anesthetic. It was meant to decrease pain. Incomplete verbal responses. Narcotic analgesics are opioids. We all know that this is a big one here in Long Island and across the country and throughout the world. By no exception, a large majority of people who are addicted to heroin and or opioids come through central testing because they were driving. In fact, a lot of the arrests we get, the addict unfortunately couldn't even wait after he picked up his drugs to have to drive to get there. So driving is still an integral part for people who need to take drugs and buy drugs and score drugs, etc. But they'll be found just passed out in the roadway with the needle in their arm, or right on the side of them in their car, because they just can't. There's no way that they could wait. They have to take the drug before these withdrawal symptoms start. So we do have a problem with people under the influence and driving. But narcotics or opioids is still very big, and we know this. And we know that the addictive rate and the death rate from this is not, throughout the country, is only slowly still increasing unbelievably. Here are some examples. OxyContin, that's the big one. Vicodin, codeine, Percocet, morphine, fentanyl. You've probably heard of fentanyl. Does everybody know what fentanyl is? It is an opioid, right? We know that it's much, much stronger than heroin, and about 50 times more, and sometimes even 75 times more. And the user doesn't necessarily know that fentanyl has been mixed in with the heroin that they're injecting. And it's so much stronger, they overdose and die. So fentanyl is a huge, huge problem that's occurring throughout the country. And here in Long Island as well. That's also on an uptick. Hydrocodone, so these are just examples. The most familiar narcotic analgesic is heroin, and is normally found in powder form. The color can range from white to brown. Typically it's heated and injected, filtered, heated and injected. Other times it's so pure now that they could just snort it, which is also a common way of taking the drug. Here are just some pictures of it. Here's some interesting facts. Where opioid misusers got their drugs. You would think a drug dealer, right? No. Given for free by a friend or a family member, almost 40%. And the other 35% is from a doctor. So the two biggest drug dealers here are the doctors and the family and friends. So think about that. Then as time goes on, they're purchased from a family or a friend, stolen, and purchased from a drug dealer. But the majority of these drugs are gotten from doctors and by friends and family. So that's something that we're getting a grip on now. Physicians are more aware of the lethality of these drugs and how quickly one can get addicted to these drugs. So they're curbing this. But we're not going to really see this effect for quite some time. We're kind of playing catch up right now when it comes to the opioid problem. Well, what do? They relieve pain. That's the main primary reason. For people who want to use, it's getting high. They induce euphoria, and that's the feeling that they're always chasing. The ironic thing about most drugs, particularly opioids, is that that very first high that somebody does experience, they'll never be able to really achieve that same high and its intensity ever again. And they're constantly chasing that same high that they'll never get. And also this drug is very unique because after a while you become dependent on it. And that high that you're searching, you're always going to have more of the drug to even get. So you constantly have to add the potency of the drug. It's known for being physically addictive with severe withdrawal symptoms. That is what we call a constricted pupil. This is very excessively constricted, and this is what you'd likely see with somebody who's under the acute influence of an opioid. Something you could look for in family members, friends, students. For police officers, this is another really good indicator for us. But again, look to the eyes. It tells us a lot about what's going on with the body. Luckily, so to speak, there's only one category that causes this extreme constriction of the eyes, and that is opioids, narcotics. So it's a dead giveaway that somebody is under the influence of a narcotic. Some general indicators: droopy eyelids, on the nod. That is when somebody is in a really deep state of relaxation, kind of like a semi-sleep. Their head is down, they hear everything, but they're essentially super relaxed. If you ask them questions, they'll answer, but their head is down and they nod and go back down. That's a telltale sign of typically opioid abuse. As opposed to somebody who's kind of knocked out from a central nervous system depressant like alcohol or Xanax, you could get their attention, but they'll still be really lethargic. You might not even be able to wake them. Here, they will be able to answer you unbelievably, unless they're going into overdose. So that's the difference. Drowsiness, dry mouth, low, raspy speech. They might talk like this, not under the acute effects of opioid. Okay, just what we see. Inhalants. We don't see this very much in impaired drivers, but youngsters, teens, preteens, even adults abuse this. Why? Because it's easy to get on the internet. It's easy to buy in stores where they're huffing and inhaling chemicals like Dust Off, a really big popular one that people abuse. They inhale Dust Off to get high. It's very short-lived, maybe 10, 15 minutes, but also very addicting. General indicators: confusion, flushed face, intense headaches, bloodshot, watery eyes, lack of muscle control, and odor, typically a chemical odor. Students have been caught where they spray their little squeegee bands that they might tie their hair with something that is will give off a chemical odor that will get you high, and they'll just sniff it during class and you won't even know it. It's embedded in the clothes that they're wearing. A part of the clothes are on their wrist, and they'll just huff all day long and get high. So the seventh and last drug category is marijuana, and that's a big one, obviously, because marijuana is the second most abused drug, second to alcohol. And we know that vaping, not only people vape nicotine, but they also vape marijuana. But marijuana is very, very prevalent throughout the whole country. And it seems like it's going to be more prevalent because more and more states are moving to recreational use of marijuana, and New York is probably going to be doing that soon as well. This is a marijuana-infused cartridge that you would screw on an electronic cigarette or a vape pen, and it's essentially odorless, unlike a burning joint. So are all joints the same? If we talk about just the leafy marijuana or cannabis plant, back in the 90s and 80s, 70s, and 60s, the THC or the tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the substance that causes the high, how much was it in the joints of yesterday years? It was about maybe 0.5% to maybe 3% loaded with THC, a typical joint from the 90s, 80s, 70s. Okay. Today, it just keeps going up and up and up. 2016, okay, you could see the percentage of THC has climbed dramatically, doubled, tripled, quadrupled. This is just in the leafy aspect of it. When you get to the vape aspect of it, like this, it's 40% THC. So the joints of 20 years ago, 2%, the joints of today, 15%, vaping it, 40%. Then you have waxes, concentrated types of THC, 70, 80, 90% loaded with THC. So think about the potency of that hitting a brain, particularly a brain of a youngster. So it's not getting any better. So far, essentially, to the date, 11 states have legalized recreational use of marijuana. That's the dark green. Okay. The light green are states that have medicinal use. New York is medicinal use. Soon to be probably recreational use. Logically, though, I don't know, this doesn't make sense to me. Medicinal, I see the purpose in that, but recreational, I'm not so convinced. It's a topic and a conversation for another time. But given the problems that we're seeing with addiction and drug use and people under the influence and driving, just logically, stepping out of the box of a police officer, just as a regular person, logically, making something now that you could just walk into a 7-Eleven or a bodega and buy THC and vape it and get it so much easier, it's just inevitably going to cause more people driving under the influence, in my opinion, and more youngsters going to have easier access to it. Whether it was through a friend's friend or an older brother, it's inevitably going to cause problems. And I'm not even talking about the problems of just setting up the brain to addiction, which I'll get into a little bit later. So it just doesn't really make much sense. It's not that we're on the decline of everything. We're not. So I don't understand why New York is going to this, but we'll see. So the U.S. marijuana market, yeah, the grass is getting greener for sure. This is in 2025, the medical total marijuana sales, 13 billion with a B. Total 24 billion. Recreational total is about 10. That's the expected. 2020, 8 billion for recreational. So, you know, follow the money. That's really what it comes down to. At the expense of what? I don't know. So there's three things I want you to think about when you look at this next slide, and I'll go over it. I know it's a little small, but I'll go over it. The three things that almost all addicts used in their younger years: nicotine, alcohol, and cannabis, one or all, while their brains were developing. Okay? Look at the three top things of sales in the U.S. Beer, 111 billion. We're a country that likes to get high. It is what it is. Cigarettes, nicotine, 80 billion. Tops the charts. Look at the third thing. The total estimated demand for cannabis, 50 to 55 billion. Those are the top three. It's not a coincidence that those are the top three things that most addicts, over 90%, okay, have used when they were developing as an adolescent, 12, 13, 14, 15. And it's the most sold. Oreos made the list. 0.7 billion. So let's look at Colorado a little bit. The money that they're making, where are they spending it? Look at that one. 30% on youth drug prevention. It seems a little bit ironical on that, right? Let's make all this money from recreational use of marijuana, but we got to put a lot of money that we make to prevent, you know, kids from getting on drugs. Schools, 26%, and that's like the building of the actual school, not necessarily funding programs inside the school. 60% other, not sure what that is, and substance abuse treatment, 28%. So between youth drug prevention and substance abuse treatment, over 50% of the money. So I think you know where I'm going with that. So general indicators: marked reddening of the conjunctiva, basically really blood red shot eyes. Odor of marijuana, but not necessarily, because they could be vaping it, which is most likely, and you won't even know it because it's very much odorless and very easy. It's no different vaping marijuana or THC than it is vaping nicotine or a flavored nicotine product. You won't know it. Body tremors, increased appetite, relaxed inhibitions, disoriented, possible paranoia, possible, depending on the dose. There have been students who just completely pass out and are catatonic from high levels of THC that they've never taken before, and then they vaped. And you're getting 40% THC in somebody who's never used it before, and they literally just pass out in a catatonic state. They can't answer you, they can't move. Impaired perception of time and distance, eyelid tremors, it's common sense. But what you'd likely see in the eyes is excessively dilated pupils under the acute effects of marijuana. So this is another indicator that can be helpful for us as law enforcement or teachers or parents. Look at the eyes. The eyes tell you a lot. CNS stimulants will also typically cause dilated pupils. So there's always something with the eyes that is linked to one of these general categories. So let's talk a little bit about vaping. Something we know is on the rise. Show of hands where you think that vaping is a problem in your school. See? Look around. It's there. It's everywhere. We're making some changes in New York, trying to get rid of the flavored stuff, raising the age to 21. In Nassau County, we have something called Project 21, where we have underage volunteers go in and see if they can buy alcohol. And if they do, then we find the place and the business, etc. And we're going to be doing that with vaping and nicotine products as well. Here's a little quick video.
Yep, that's exactly what.
Any of this works at all. So where do you put the fluid, hot water, you need power? I know nothing about this.
Yep, that's exactly what I thought. What the heck is a Juul?
What is a Juul? A Juul is a closed-loop vape system. It consists of a battery and a pre-filled pod. The pre-filled pod is filled with e-liquid with a high nicotine volume. A Juul is very easy to use. All you do is put the pod in and vape away.
Lots of high school kids would never think of smoking. They've grown up with anti-tobacco ads.
This contract, I relinquished part of my freedom to you.
The scary thing is they don't think of vaping as smoking a cigarette or as smoking.
Vaping can deliver nicotine to your brain.
It is true that Juuls don't have a lot of the toxic chemicals that, say, a cigarette has. But a tiny Juul pod has the equivalent amount of nicotine that's contained in an entire pack of cigarettes. So why would kids Juul?
They love the flavors.
I've heard a lot of kids say, like, it just gives them a quick buzz. They feel good after they do it.
You see the younger celebrities, they're holding a jewel in their hand, and everyone on Snapchat will like post videos of them jeweling. They just find it as a way to be cool.
If you have money, you can get it super easy. Just ask anyone.
One of the things that makes it really hard for educators is that Juuls are really easy to hide.
So if I'm a student, I'm not just like this, but if I have a pocket or if I put it right here.
Juuls look so similar to, say, thumb drives, right? It's really easy to get confused. And of course, kids take advantage of this. So a lot of students told me about a game they play in class where a student will go up to a teacher who has no idea what a Juul is and say, hey, I've got my, presentation on this thumb drive. Can I charge it on your computer, please? Because I really need to have it. And then they go ahead and charge their Juul on the teacher's computer, and teachers have no idea.
It's very tricky. It's made to be very tricky to trick us. So it's therefore simple as teachers to know if they're actually vaping.
So what's a teacher to do? Here are some of the things you can look for in your classroom.
So your typical high school bathroom, right?
Frequent or long bathroom breaks. A lot of kids go to the bathroom and then they hang out juuling. In fact, it's become so common that schools across the country have either cut down on the number of bathrooms that are open. Teachers may monitor the bathroom, sometimes even principals.
You might have 5 or 6 kids hanging out in here with the door closed and vaping.
Watch out for kids who cover their face with their hands, who sometimes have sleeves next to their nose, who put their head down often. It may be they're just tired, they're teenagers, right? But it could be that they're vaping in class. A principal I spoke to said one of the most effective methods he used was really involving parents. So, for example, he didn't just talk to kids about the problem. He had after-school seminars where he would invite parents And then it grew even bigger. It wasn't just parents, he actually invited the entire community so that there were lots of sets of eyes on his students. And parents are still really influential in their teen's life. I mean, just listen to what this one kid, Zane, said to me.
My mom gonna play that. Yes, that's not simple.
Your mom is a very
Yeah.
smart kid.
Yeah, my mom would kill me.
Okay, so that's just a quick video, probably something that you all know already. Juul is just one type of vaping device. If you just search the internet, there are so many different devices that are meant to be hidden in a person's sweatshirt, in their hoodie, in their string that looks like a hood string, but it's not. It's where they inhale the vaping, the vape from a device that's kind of embedded in their clothing. It's everywhere. So it's an issue in all schools, from what I'm gathering, and it's kind of a serious one. I mean, taking a look from the outside in, oh, what's the big deal, blah, blah, blah. But actually, it's a very big deal. I'm going to go into that. But, you know, some kids say, oh, I don't do the THC vaping. They don't know if they do or not. It might be introduced and they don't even know it. Or they just do the fruity flavor. I don't even do the nicotine. So there was a very good study put out, and this is kind of the summary of it, of e-juice nicotine content. 52% of them that they tested, and they tested quite a lot of different brands, had more nicotine than labeled. 91 of the samples had nicotine despite being labeled nicotine-free. And they were all made in the USA. So over 90% of the ones that said nicotine-free had nicotine in them. Okay, so it's an issue, even if it says nicotine-free. There's likely still nicotine in the vaping liquid, which obviously can cause potential problems, particularly with addiction, because nicotine is highly, highly addictive. So here's different parts of the brain that are typically affected or responding or responsive to alcohol. The frontal lobe, the cerebellum for balance, in the middle, you know, dopamine and all the feeling good stuff. Sometimes we do silly things when we're drunk because that's dealing with the frontal lobe. Marijuana, okay? Here's part of the brain that's highly sensitive. Opiates, a very strong reward pleasure system. Cocaine, same. Look at this. Anybody want to guess what this is? Look how much of the brain is responsive and reactive. That's nicotine. Yes. Look at these. That's nicotine. So it is a big deal, nicotine, for everybody, but it's a really big deal for when a person's brain, such as a youngster, a preteen, teen, young adult, and their brain's actually still developing. It's like a sledgehammer to the brain, along with alcohol and marijuana, the three most abused drugs. So there are common themes for drug addiction. Early use is the biggest one. Trauma or underlying mental illness, and genetics. There is a genetic predisposition if you have family members who were an addict or had substance abuse problems. You can be more sensitive to becoming an addict or somebody who uses drugs, unfortunately in a very dependent way. But it's one of the few things that we could correct, even though there's a genetic tendency towards it, unbelievably. And that's by delaying the introduction of these drugs while your brain is developing. So you could actually beat the genetic predisposition. That's the challenge, though, keeping young adults and teens and preteens off of these three most commonly used drugs early on. And again, this is the reason. Anybody in this room under the age of 25? Okay, your brains are still developing. In fact, by the time you leave here today, your brain's a little different than it was when you first walked in. And this is the problem when we introduce nicotine, alcohol, and or marijuana or any other drug, but those most frequently used with the developing brain of a child, a preteen, 12, 13, 14, through high school, college, because it literally rewires the brain. This is something I really have to emphasize. Neuroscience is finally keeping pace with drug addiction, and we know now that it's a brain-based problem. It's not a discipline problem. It's not a poor moral compass problem. There are many facets and dynamics to drug addiction. I'm not saying that, okay? But we know it's a brain-based problem because of the developing brain and the introduction of these drugs to kids. The three big ones, remember the slide I had? The most sold products? Marijuana, nicotine, alcohol. So it's not developed till it's about 25 years old. And the earlier you take these drugs, the more that brain is going to change. It'll literally rewire itself to make you more sensitive to addiction. It's like somebody literally taking your brain, changing it, and giving it back to you. And now you're going to be very likely to become an addict when you continue to use these, because you're taking in these products earlier on. That's why we have to prevent it. Okay, we have to prevent the introduction of these, particularly these three substances, while a person's brain is developing. It literally wires the developing brain for addiction. 99% of addiction starts when your brain is developing. If you ask the majority of addicts, when did they first start taking drugs? It was between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. And that is prime time for the beginning of brain development. Your brain's constantly developing, but prime time for them to be possibly introduced to these drugs. Now their brain is set up literally, taken hostage, rewired, changed, to be more sensitive to becoming an addict without their control. And these two things is what happens when you have a high THC content, okay, or any THC content, but the THC now in a vape device or even in a joint or waxes on a developing brain of a high schooler or even a college student, okay, it's again like a sledgehammer to the brain. It causes so many different problems to the brain. And these two things is what starts occurring in this teenager or young adult. I have to do it, which is compulsion, and I can't stop thinking about it, perseveration. And you'll see this among students. In fact, you'll see this with people who are not even on drugs, right? Some people are just like this. In fact, there's some experts that say addiction starts before they even take a drug. But this is what occurs when these drugs hit a developing brain. These two things, they have to do with their compulsion, and their perseveration takes over because their brains haven't been pruned, so to speak. They haven't been cultivated the right way. They were developing, and that's the problem. That's one of the main problems. Some examples, long-term effects. This person, heroin and methadone, a normal view on the left. The right is a 40-year-old, 7 years on methadone, heroin for 10 years. Here's a non-smoker, 42 years old, good brain activity up top. A smoker on the bottom. 15-year-old male, non-drinker. Good reactivity to the brain. 15-year-old male who drinks while performing a memory task, this was. There's nothing going on there. 15 years old, developing brain. 8%, what's that number? Well, the good news is if we delay the abuse of these, particularly these three drugs, on the developing brain, you'll have about an 8% less of a chance of becoming an addict every year. So delaying is really the key. That's why most addicts become addicts, because they took these drugs very young. If you're over 25 and start using these drugs, it's very unlikely, statistically, you will become an addict. So for every year you can delay or help your children stay away from these drugs, you're just giving them an 8% chance of not becoming an addict every year. So from 12 years old to 18 years old, they don't take these drugs, marijuana, alcohol, THC, etc. That's almost a 50% less likely chance that they're going to become an addict. That's pretty good, don't you think? Something that we could do When I give these talks over and over, I have my kids listen to them a lot. They had no idea what occurs with the brain. They didn't know their brains were developing. From my 9-year-old to my 18-year-old, it was something that was an eye-opener for them. So it's something that we need to think about and remember. We are living in a different era. We have to educate ourselves, we have to be proactive, and prevention is always best. But we have some warning signs we have to look out for with our students and our family members. Rapidly changing grades, glazed or spaced out expression, abandoning friends or hanging out with a different crowd, abandoning social activities. Think about it. Do you see students like this? Do you see maybe some of your children's or some of your children's friends? A deterioration in personal grooming or physical appearance, a drop in attendance in school or work, a loss of interest in activities, engaging in secret or suspicious behavior, excessive lying. Are you catching your students lying? Are your kids lying? Are your friends' kids lying more? Okay, so these are really some telltale signs that something could be awry other than just being a regular teenager. Okay? I have 5 children of my own. These are my 5 boys. This is about a 1.5, 2-year-old picture. My youngest is 9, and my oldest is just entered Stony Brook. He's 18. So, as a drug recognition expert, as a police officer who teaches this and talks about it, and bombards my kids with it every day and gives proper examples, there's no alcohol in my house, etc., etc. I was very shocked when I got a call from my son, who was 14 at the time, from the school saying he was caught vaping in the bathroom. Unbelievable, right? How? How did it get through me, a drug recognition expert? Okay? Because it could happen to anybody. And I was thankful that, hell, it got through me. Thankfully, the school caught it. So you can make a difference. Now, immediately, I made some changes to his life. And I immediately drug tested him. I'm checking my time. Immediately drug tested him with a urine test, because I needed to know, was it nicotine or was it THC? Because if I knew it was THC, I had probably some bigger problems on my hands, because I know what happens with the developing brain, and time is of the essence. And I would need to have to make a serious change in my son's life. Thankfully, he tested negative for any THC. But he promised me it was only one time. So I check his phone and check his texts, and no, oh, bring the pen over, we'll do tricks, and over, and so it wasn't just one time. He just got caught one time. That was a couple of years ago. So with the changes, and et cetera, he's been excellent. And so is the rest of my kids, thank God, for now. But it changed me, because I look back and I didn't see the red flags that I talk about. He would immediately go out with his friends and then come back, new set of friends. I would say, Ryan, I never met this kid you're hanging out with. Have him come to the house. I want to meet your friend. Never happened. We're busy. He'd come home and go right up to his room. That's suspicious. In the back of my mind, I'm doing dishes. I'm like, well, he just came home and went right to his room. It's gnawing at me, but it was so far in the back of my mind, I didn't think about it, because he was hiding his vape pen in his room, because I searched his room immediately also, which I encourage you to do. If you have kids who drive, take their car and fill it up with gas for them. But while you're in the car, look around, smell, see, any marijuana debris, little things like that. So nevertheless, I saw these little telltale signs. Hanging out with new friends, I catch him in lies more often, okay? Being really secretive with certain things. It was all there in front of me, and I missed it, okay? Thankfully, I was able to stop it early on, where he's not ingesting these. He volunteers to take drug tests and nicotine tests for me now, because he wants to show that he's never doing that again, and he doesn't hang out with those same friends. And I talk to the parents. I let them know. I wanted to. I don't want those parents blinded also, like I was, and they made changes too. So things were very positive, and I actually thanked the school for doing what they were doing. He was the only one who admitted it out of the 4 kids who were doing it at the same time. They all got expelled out of school. He got an in-school suspension because they actually told the truth. Ryan, were you vaping? Yes. So that's my little story, but thankfully everything worked out okay.